Well, good evening and welcome to Libraries and the Poets Who Love Them. I'm Dr. Elizabeth DeWolf, Professor of History and Acting Director of the Maine Women Writers Collection. And on behalf of the collection's curator, Sarah Baker, and myself, it's our pleasure to welcome poets Julia Bouwsma, Margaret Yocom, and Emma Gibbon, and all of you to this event. So this evening, we will hear from 4 poets, all of whom work in libraries or in archives. Each will read for about 10 minutes or so. Then we'll turn to questions and conversation. Those of you watching on Zoom can post a question in chat at any point in the program, and I'll relay those questions in due time. The chat feature, as I'm sure all of you know, is at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you can also comment or ask a question, and we'll share those with our guests as well. While we gather here tonight in the shadow of Thanksgiving, let us begin by acknowledging that we are holding this event in Wabanaki territory, this beautiful, bountiful, and inspiring land that so many of us call home. And as we acknowledge this, we also acknowledge that shaping and sharing words has a long tradition in this land. I'd like to begin by sharing a poem from Mi'kmaq poet Rita Joe. They say that I must live a white man's way, this day and age still being bent to what they say. My heart remains tuned to native time. I lost my talk, the talk you took away when I was a little girl at Shubenacadie School. You snatched it away. I speak like you, I think like you, I create like you, the scrambled ballad about my word. 2 ways I talk, both ways I say, your way is more powerful. So gently, I offer my hand and ask, let me find my talk so I can teach you about me. While I have the honor of welcoming you all, our host tonight is my UNE colleague and author, Jefferson Navicky. Allow me a few minutes to introduce Jefferson, and he in turn will introduce our poet guests. Jefferson Navicky is the archivist for the Maine Women Writers Collection, and he teaches English at Southern Maine Community College. Hailing from southeastern Ohio, Jefferson earned his BA in English Literature from Denison University and an MFA in Writing and Poetics from Naropa University. He's the award-winning author of 3 books, including the poetic novel, The Book of Transparencies, and the story collection, The Paper Coast. His work has received several acknowledgments and awards, including a Good Idea Grant from the Maine Arts Commission, 2 Maine Literary Awards for drama and poetry, and he was the winner of the 2019 Maine Postmark Poetry Contest. He's also a playwright, and his plays have been produced in the Boston Theater Marathon, multiple times in the Maine Playwrights Festival, and in small venues across New England. His 10-minute play, One Master Appetite, was included in the Best 10-Minute Plays of 2015. Jefferson has held several residencies, including at the iPark Foundation, Stonington Opera House, St. Luke's Cathedral, and Hunoaks. He's a former member of the editorial board of the Cafe Review and is a longtime poetry out loud judge throughout Maine. So tonight we gather to share poetry, but also we would like to take a moment to celebrate Jefferson's most recent work, Antique Densities, Modern Parables and Other Experiments in Short Prose. It's wonderful. So as I turn the microphone over to Jefferson, let us congratulate him on the launch of his latest work. Congratulations, Jefferson. The mic is yours.
Thank you, Beth. Thanks so much for that thoughtful and thorough introduction. So when the Maine Women Writers Collection was so generous to offer me a reading in celebration of this new book. I knew pretty much immediately what I wanted to do for the launch, is I'd get a bunch of poets together and celebrate libraries, because like, what could be more fun than that, at least in my mind. And for one reason is that libraries are, and pretty much any library, are my favorite places to spend time. And secondly, and particularly for this book, that Antique Densities is a tribute to libraries. The title is taken from a Shirley Hazard novel. It's one of my favorite novels of hers, The Transit of Venus. There's a sentence in there that, in the veiled light with an antique densities of books behind him. And then there are lots of pieces in the book that are tributes to libraries, and they run the gamut from library as kind of treasure vault for books, or library as kind of a shrine to the act of reading, but also libraries as the place for confusion, sometimes as a place of mischief, and even as the site of love. So I'm going to read a few of these pieces from the book about libraries, and then I'm going to introduce the rest of tonight's readers. So this first piece is called Uses of a Library. It was inspired by a movie that I love, The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje, and a book who I also love, but it's one of those rare occasions where the book and the movie seemed both really good to me. And this is the scene, inspired originally by the scene in the movie when Juliette Binoche's character is in the bombed out Italian villa. So it started with that and went a whole bunch of other places. The uses of a library. She removed 14 books, nailed them together to make a step ladder for the kitchen. Most of the chairs had been used for fires, but one armchair was left because it had been soaked by rain. She removed the seat cushion of the chair and replaced it with soil that yielded long, thin stalks of grass. Other books, missing more than 100-page passages, she used as journals, writing across margins and around illustration plates. Waterlogged books weighed double and couldn't close flat, warped in waves, only good for periodic burnings. Some books, when she felt like it, she snapped hard shut to create a buckle of noise that cracked throughout the house, erasing bird calls and other previous sounds, and creating echoes whose souls excited the hollow places of the house. Other, private books. With a series of encyclopedias, she built a considerably dark well within a sticky patch of night that effectively defined its air but never drew water, for water was cursed here and had already caused so much destruction. Water damaged and exiled, she read of ghosts at night, reading beneath a single hanging bulb that sprayed its undiscerning light in a copper-tinted sprawl that at other stages of her life would have hurt her eyes with its tiny spikes, but now was the only possible light, except for the moon, that broke into silver fish and created soft noise in the trees, bouncing off the leaves enough by which to read. And so she turned off the light. And then the next piece I'm going to read is a strange short piece that, if in the kind of line of library pieces, this might be the library as a good place to die, as a certain version of heaven. It's called The Middle Distance. From a window at the long end of the Bramhall Library, she saw the Duke splayed out on the bricks of Pollard Square, calling to her with his eyes. "My girl," he seemed to say, "my end is here, and I wish to die with an acceptable view." She meant to ignore his plaintive face and continue reading, but her book began to wrinkle and pull itself away the way water shrinks and bends a paper sheaf. And so she thought she would. His hand was rough like cracked clay, and he fell into her weight. They walked together, and she brought him up the marble steps into the library's potent scent and down some halls to the Winston room, the room full of maps under glass she so loved. Here, he said, bring me to the window with a dull, bright glow. I want to die gazing out into the middle distance. And the middle distance grew until it was almost everywhere, stretching into a tinted glaze that spread his feeble-bodied like a zeroed thing. And the final piece I'm going to read is called The Library of the Forest, and it's kind of a fantastical library poem. It's inspired by that phrase, the Library of the Forest, was inspired by a Spanish artist named Miguel Angel Blanco that a biologist friend, told us about. And my wife liked that phrase, so she kept that phrase and wrote it down in a notebook. And we went out for a date at a Mexican restaurant, and we did this little writing prompt on the Library of the Forest. And the restaurant was terrible. The margaritas were really bad, but it was a fun date in that we got, or at least I got this poem out of it. So the Library of the Forest. Many years ago, when it was first put here by those who believed in the magic down the moss, the words formed by lichen that told of how it used to be and how to keep the green green in the tilt in the rock, we were not alive. We found it like this. The books live well in the Library of the Forest. We haven't added anything. We didn't think it needed it. And so our stewardship is to read on the mossy reclines, to make our way through the volumes left to us. I have taken science and she has taken literature, and we will meet in the middle where the birches bend below the rotted pine. She tells me what I've missed. I read to her my favorite passages earmarked with a sap cluster that will last for a very long time, but the forever we have always envisioned does not forever, as no forever does, so we must plan. We don't know who will find the library after we've gone. We wish we could know, could find the right people to take over the task of green and reading. But we haven't seen anyone for years upon years, just deer and squirrels and the occasional edible mushroom that by now feels like a fellow living creature. We're tired, but we're not done yet, but soon will be. We know the library could sit dormant for years, and of course we worry, but we tell ourselves we found it once by chance, and so can others. It only takes the few to carry on the work of reading, of holding this living thing in your heart. Thanks, everybody, for listening. So now I have the pleasure of introducing our next reader, Emma J. Gibbon. Emma J. Gibbon is an award-winning horror writer, Rising-nominated speculative poet, and librarian. Her debut fiction collection, Dark Blood Comes from the Feet, which is such a great title, was one of NPR's best books of 2020 and won the Maine Literary Award for Speculative Fiction. Her poetry has been published in Strange Horizons, Pedestal Magazine, and Kaleidoscope. I really practiced that before and I almost got it right. Emma lives with her husband, Steve, and 3 exceptional animals, Odin, Mothra, and Grim, in a spooky little house in the woods. She is a member of the Horror Writers Association and the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you from after hours in my office in the Topsham Public Library. Because I am a speculative poet, so most of my poems are horror and science fiction, I really had to take the theme very broadly before I start. So, and usually if I write about monsters, the monsters are usually good guys. So this first poem, I promise, is complimentary. So this is called The Librarians. Between the stacks, you can catch glimpses of them. Pale skin and skinny limbs flitting between shelves. They haunt your nightmares, those feral faces gnawing on old books, sharp teeth full of print, digesting knowledge. Their feverish eyes blaze above dark shadows and hollowed out cheeks. You'll never catch them. They've been here much longer than you. And as your hair grows grey and grows closer and closer to the floor, they will stay young, just out of reach of your grasping fingers, forever being something you're not. Okay. This next one was inspired by the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. And I was able to visit there because I was at a library convention there. So that's the link. And it's a prose poem. Medical Museum Midnight Raid. I will smash the glass and liberate the specimens, the suicides, the murderers, the forgotten and the poor. I will stash your skulls in my loot sack, the leathery feet and the hair bezoars and the shrunken heads, the lungs injected with ink, the cysts and bladder stones, the slices of organs and misshaped body parts. You'll all come with me. I'll unstring the skeletons, young and old, the giant and the dwarf, the corset warped and the disease ravaged, and I will bind your bones for travel. And you, prodigies in your pickle jars, those never born or born not for long, the cyclops, the conjoined twins, the mermaid and the pig child, the babe with 3 legs. I will stop at your receptacles and whisper, I am sorry to all of you. I will whisper that you don't have to stay here any longer. Your stasis, your swimming in place is done, and I will juggle all your jars in my arms, cradle you and leave the museum, and no one will know. And later in the woods, I will dig deep. I'll bury the bones and inter the body parts. Your job is done. We don't need to learn more from you. You get to be part of the earth. Decay is your reward. Be forgotten and rest. There's models and 3D images and photographs and scans and records. Rest among the roots, the giant and dwarf and all of you others. Your bones will hide in the dirt. You've been ogled enough. And the little ones, the monsters and the too small, I will pour out your liquor and hope it doesn't poison the trees. Your poor shriveled skin will fill the air one more time before I entomb you. This is where you were supposed to go. You just got stuck in the in-between. I will tenderly place you in the ground. Be caressed by the soil. Let it fill you. You did your part. You are beautiful. And that one was published by Pedestal magazine. This next one, Persephone, was published, and I'm going to mangle it, in Kaleidotrope, and it's inspired by the myth. She can't remember the last time she left the apartment. Smoke curls the wallpaper and the dead rise from black trash bags. Her hands, held out in front of her, are wrong. She wanted her mother's hands. Here they are, shadow ringing over the dirty carpet. His cigarettes on the kitchen counter. He wouldn't notice if she took one. Slide one out with slender fingers, flick the lighter, kiss of grey hissing out towards the glowing curtains. Is the door even locked? If she could just get a slice of sunlight, a sliver of fruit in her throat, everything would be all right until summer. This one was inspired by a little-known horror author of Maine, someone called Stephen King. This poem was just published in the Horror Writers Association's poetry showcase, and it's called Carrie. Steam and dream and estrogen, your hands, freckled thighs, the white rafts that sailed towards you would not save you, would not stop the bleeding, no matter how they clung to your leg. Prom dress pink was never your colour, always red, even in split screen. Your problem was always your mother, isn't it always? This next one is called Fever Dreams. In this one, I run away to the circus, tour a myriad of Midwest towns, sew in sequins and eyes shut, become the owner's right-hand woman. But then in the dead of night, when the midway lights have gone dim, sick of it all, I unlock all of the animals' cages and steal away. But not before I leave a solitary gold coin pilfered from the owner under the pillows of each of the sideshow. The road to town follows me. In this one, I am a gorgon, all snakes and righteous malice. My hair strikes all those who have wronged me, while my stare stops them dead in their tracks. In this one, I am an ancient priestess, throwing bones and entrails to foretell the future. The timeline is confused, though, and I lie to my people about the harvest to come. In this one, the real one, I lie in bed in this joke of a sanitarium. All hope for a cure is lost here, nothing but salt pills and unnecessary surgery. Propped up by pillows, I watch the sunrise and feel the infection fill my lungs. The heavy wetness pulls me down into the sea of sleep. And let's see, I believe this is the final one. And this one is for Mary Shelley, who, in my opinion, is one of the foremothers of science fiction and horror, despite what certain newspapers have said recently. Lady Frankenstein. There is lightning overhead, thunder too, the blue-black electricity of dark skies, tinged with orange phosphorus. Trees waving in the wind, limbs whipping, losing leaves. There's white flesh in the black soil, clammy and cold. My hands are claws digging through the mulch, cleaning away the debris, detritus clinging to dead skin. My preferred salutation is doctor. I promised I would bring her back, bring them all back. I promised her. They didn't let me dress her for burial, threw her in a pit in the backyard, but I noticed the place. Now I can dig around her, excavate her, lift her from this insult of a grave. She's heavy and waterlogged, but I am strong. I fling her over my shoulder, the rain hits harder, washes the dirt from her, soaks my apron to my skin, plasters my hair into my eyes. It's not too far to the workshop, across the yard, through the barn door, but I'll admit that I'm out of breath by the time I carry her up the stairs. I rest her on the platform finally. I rest and wait for a great arc of electricity to split the skies, cover this land with static charge, and bring her home. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. That was great. That I keep thinking about that poem about freeing the bones from the museum, and it's like all of a sudden that's something like a mark of a good poem is you give me the idea of something now that I've always wanted to do, and I only realized it once I heard.
You can join me. We can get a gang.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So our next reader is Margaret Yocom. Margaret Yocom searched libraries across the world as she wrote All Kinds of Fur, erasure poems, and new translation of A Tale from the Brothers Grimm, Deerbrook Editions, 2018. She founded the Folklore Studies Program and the Northern Virginia Folklife Archive of George Mason University, where she taught for 36 years. A resident of Farmington, she has also written on Inuit storytelling in Northwest Alaska and on the folk arts of Rangeley's logging community. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you, Jefferson. I'm going to share my screen as I work tonight. Well, thank you so much, Jefferson, to you and your colleagues. It's good to read with you and Emma and Julia. Thanks so much to everyone who's joined us. Tonight, I'm going to be reading from All Kinds of Fur, my book of erasure poems. When I first learned about erasure poetry, I knew immediately what text I wanted to work with. The controversial tale called All Kinds of Fur. For decades, I've been mesmerized by it. It's a cousin to Cinderella, but it opens with incest and with a young woman who escapes her father by shifting skins. I've also long been held in thrall by tales about skin that tell of beings who move back and forth between human skin and other skins, like animal skins. These tales ask us, what is it to be human, to be other, to be both? You may never have heard of all kinds of fur. Editors don't include it in anthologies. I searched for versions across the world and found pigskin in Russia, sackcloth in Palestine, donkey skin in France, and many more. Erasure poets, we choose different kinds of source texts to engage with. For example, after September 11th, Travis McDonald wanted to critique US foreign policy. So he created erasures from the 9/11 Commission report. With Kinsfur, I wanted the young woman to tell her own story in her own voice. So I keep all the Grimm's words on the page, most are ghosted gray, and I show her story, my poems, rising up out of the text in bold. Since both stories are on the page, you can hear the young woman contradicting and disputing with the brothers. Here's part of my writing process. I'd take what I thought was a moment in the Grimm's tale, line it out, and then see what words were available to me. Often the words I found helped me discover all kinds of fur's story. Let me tell you a very brief summary of the tale. Once there was a princess whose widowed father came to her one day and said, "We are going to marry." She gives him 4 impossible tasks. Bring me 3 celestial gowns and a mantle made out of a piece of fur of every animal in your kingdom. Somehow he brings her all 4, so she plans her escape. That night, she puts her 3 gowns in a nutshell, wraps herself in her fur mantle, and flees into the forest. The next morning, the huntsmen of the neighboring king find her sleeping in the hollow trunk of a tree. They laugh and name her all kinds of fur and take her to the castle kitchen, where she labors for years with the cook. And she always wears that fur mantle until the king, in search of a queen, holds 3 balls. All kinds of fur, dresses herself in her gowns, dances with the king, and then disappears. She puts her fur mantle back on and goes to the kitchen to make the king's midnight soup. During the last ball, the king slips a ring on her finger, follows her, removes her fur mantle, and sees her in her gown as bright as the stars in a midnight sky, and realizes who she is. They marry. All Kinds of Fur is an immense story that places vital questions before us. As I wrote, my guiding question was always, what would all kinds of fur say? Tonight, I'll be reading from the first section of Kinsfur, and John Slack, my co-reader, and I will alternate in the first 2 poems. He'll read the Grimm's words, and I'll read the words of All Kinds of Fur. Then I'll carry on alone. I look forward to your comments and questions later.
Once there was a king who had a wife with golden hair, and she was so beautiful that no one like her existed anywhere on earth. It happened that she lay ill, and when she felt that she would soon die, she called the king and spoke. After my death, if you intend to wed again, take no one who is not just as beautiful as I am, and who has not such golden hair as I have. This must you promise me. After the king promised her this, she closed her eyes and died.
Oh, golden hair and ashes. My intent is a promise close here.
For a long time, the king could not be consoled, and he would not let himself even think about taking a second wife. Finally, his counselor spoke. It cannot be otherwise. The king must wed again so that we will have a queen. Now messengers were sent far and wide to find a bride whose beauty would match that of the dead queen completely. But in the entire world, there was no such a one to be found. And even if they had found one, there was certainly no one who had such golden hair. So the messengers returned home, their task unfulfilled.
For a long time, I would not even think about his tell. But if they, tell. Daughter, mother, such golden hair, she, her, she, wife, me. I, a daughter, a dead wife, an other bride. Oh, come, kingdom, be drawn into ruin. The night herder's maw opens first. Get a man piece, pelt, gut, skin. Turn, turn, rutten, turn, run. His done dear nears. Catch, cut, skin, hide. All is red, all hind, hope, hand. Go, go, oh, go, 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 moon and stars, a shell, fur and soot, go. Walk nigh, Hecate, call down a fell sleep and still. So begin it, ring around, skin game, hide and seek. Touch a forsaken other, it, me, you, all kinds of see. The ashes are cast. Here, under here, a layer, a lie. Wood, fire, ashes, knives, a kingdom. One so castled may while and watch. A side door opens. Steer. Thank you.
Wow, Peggy, that was such a rich presentation. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Jefferson.
I just as an archivist, when you show that sheet of all of your words that are around as in the process of creating your poem, that is just like a gold mine. That's really, really interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, then I have a pleasure of introducing our final reader tonight. Julia Bouwsma is an off-the-grid homesteader, poet, librarian, and editor, and was recently appointed the 6th Poet Laureate of Maine. Bouwsma is the author of 2 poetry collections, Midden, Fordham University Press 2018, and Work by Bloodlight, Cider Press Review 2017. Honors she has received include the 2019 and 2018 Maine Literary Awards for Poetry Book, the 2016-17 Poets Out Loud Prize, and the 2015 Cider Press Review Book Award. She serves as the library director for Webster Library in Kingfield, Maine, and is currently teaching in the creative writing department at the University of Maine at Farmington. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you so much, Jefferson. It's such an honor to read with all of you today. I realized about 2 minutes ago that I should have planned to read my poem about visiting with Edna St. Vincent Millay's nightgown at the Maine Women Writers Collection, but it's really not done yet, so I'm not going to. I'm sorry. It's a hard one to write. I think it's going to take a few versions. So I am a librarian, and I wish that I wrote all the time about libraries. But when I go back over my work, it turns out that I'm not writing overtly about libraries all that often. In fact, pretty much not at all. So I prepared for this by going through my 2 books and my current manuscript in progress and trying to find all of the poems that had archive or book, or books or such in them. And what I realized is that these things are present in all of my work in a certain way, but what the role that they play has shifted over time. So in my first book, I think I was really focused on the idea of stories that we inherit, stories that are given to us that don't necessarily represent us, and how we can work with those and change them and get rid of what we don't need and make them our own. And then in my second book, Midden, which deals with the Malaga Island eviction and erasure, I was working directly with archive, but a very, a deeply fragmented and deliberately wounded archive. And now in my recent work, I'm discovering that I'm again working with archive, and I would say library and archive, I tend to think of almost interchangeably. But really, in a lot of ways, the archives that we're carrying ourselves. And so we have inherited story, but also what we've inherited from our ancestors in terms of trauma, or stories that we're carrying inside our bodies, or stories that we don't even have access to, but are still carrying and working with and engaging. And then also the idea of, I've been really interested in the idea of reading texts that are not texts, so non-language texts. So I've been thinking I started whitewater kayaking, and I've been thinking about how we talk about reading the river. And when you ski, you talk about reading the hill. And I've done a lot of competitive dog training, and we talk about reading the dog. So I'm really fascinated with these types of reading that we do. And so I'm taking great liberties with what I consider to be a library in some of these poems, as you will see. I thought I would read one poem from Midden that deals with archive, and then I'm going to read some new ones that deal with this concept in looser ways. This is a poem. There's a whole sequence of poems that runs through this book, and they're letters to ghosts. And this is one where I'm sort of specifically dealing with archive. Dear ghosts, I pick the list for names like herringbones from the fish's oiled cavity. I run them between my teeth, stroke the scarred light of photographs, your granulated faces, mimeographed eyes always left in the dark. I take up scissors, razor blades, the rusted garden loppers, pinking shears. I scissor you to islands, rearrange until my fingerprints peel your faces gray. I bind you to my walls. I let you hang. You watch me sleep, your silence a bloodburst in my mouth. I dream of ink, wake as a stain against my sheets. Finally, I shred the maps, scatter the portraits, watch you faceless flutter down. 100-year-old snow dusts the ground. This is our only blessing. Bury you in the yard, sing as I fingernail our forgetting into the bone clay. So then I'll read a couple of newer ones. So I found myself again working with research, and I think I can't seem to stop now, but I've been working with scientific articles recently that deal with tracing epigenetic memory and the idea of inherited trauma. So this is from trying to take history and make it sing, I'm now trying to make science sing, which is even harder, I'm finding. This is called Study in Epigenetic Memory. To stress the newborn mice, researchers separate them from their mother, force her to swim laps in a small pool for 3 hours each day. The mice grow neurotic, no surprise to the scientists. But when they breed the neurotic mice with normal mice, the neurosis persists 3 generations out. When I search online for neurotic behavior patterns in mice, I just get links advising me on how to manage my own symptoms, which WebMD assures me are caused by constant worry and negativity. Even the internet seems to know I'm searching for scorch marks everywhere, like there's an epicenter, a single origin point for the smolder inside me. Here's my secret about worry. I believe most bad things are things we've never thought could happen, which means each terrible occurrence I conjure up is one less likely to happen, which is to say, I believe worrying keeps catastrophe at bay. A mind that runs a wheel is nothing new in my family, and running a wheel isn't a sign of captivity-bred neurosis, at least not in mice. Studies show wild field mice will enjoy running a metal wheel if one is left out. And I could free associate on mice for hours. The genetic experiments my husband performed on them as a high school intern at a famous lab where they once bred a mouse named piebald megacolon who had no asshole and ate until he distended and died, or the mice raised with lesions to test the off-label use of the cholesterol drug that lessens the risk of bleeding in my sister's brain, or the childhood food dish full of squirming babies the time the pet store incorrectly sexed our 2 male mice and sold us a breeding pair, which is how we discovered that once mice start breeding, it's nearly impossible to contain their population growth. I can't recall what we did with all the baby mice, probably sold some back to the pet store, where they likely ended up as supper for snakes. If nothing else, mice are an excellent lesson on the vast and tangled histories of human brutality, which I'm considering now, again, reading yet another article on inherited traumatic memory, this time about Civil War Confederate soldiers subjected to starvation in the POW camps, how their sons had an 11% higher mortality rate. This observation is interrupted by an advertisement suggesting I might prefer another topic, such as what happens when the food runs out, or wet countries that are running dry, or why more men take their own lives. The article, when it resumes, is filled with stock photos of families prancing along the beach, families in swimsuits by a tropical lake, families arm in arm, the fathers and sons reduced to shadowed outlines and ghostly hands, their bodies replaced by bomb burst and a pulsing, mushrooming fear. So I think the idea that we are living archives, that we are carrying archive within us. This poem too, along the same veins as that, but we do have a little shout out for Edna St. Vincent Millay here. This is called I Have No Answer But Stones. Who will walk between me and the crying of the frogs? Edna St. Vincent Millay. Either you believe or you don't, my friend says. Which is it? We're parked on the dirt road in darkness, beer bottles balanced on the hood of her truck. It's Passover, and I'm speaking in stories again, counting them out like drops of wine on a white serving plate. 1 for blood, 2 for frogs. In the bog below the hill, the peepers weave a net of their shrieking. They cinch the night's throat taut. How to say I believe most in the power of what I do not know. Secondly, in the power of that which I can hold in a closed fist. We collect stones from the road by headlamp. My friend likes purple ones best. This is how I learned to carry stories, to tuck them into my pocket, familiar weight chafing my thigh. What my ancestors must have carried shuffling toward exile. A story pressed onto a child's tongue is not the same as bread, but it will suffice for a time. Before me, a woman bends under her bundle. From the bundle, a thin string of rice keeps pouring over the street. I think of nothing. Wrote 14-year-old Yitzhak Rudachevsky in his diary the day the Jews were herded from Vilna. What does one haul beneath a body that doesn't know its own ghosts? If the stories clink like stones at the bottom of my empty sack, they give me a rhythm to walk by. If they rattle bones or doorknobs on nights as dark as this one, I know I'll let them in. Listen, I tell my friend, then stop. I have no answer. I drink more beer. I load my pockets with more and larger stones. Each year the frogs shrill a tower of glass to the top of the sky. Each year they scream until it shatters us. So I will maintain steadfastly that a dirt road is a library full of stones. And in this poem, I guess I am also going to proclaim that an outhouse, an orchard, and a well are also libraries. This is called Drought Diary. And this is a kind of a rambling prose poem. Drought Diary. When I wake, my belly is full with impending rain, forehead furrowed to cloud. A mess, I go to write on my neighbor's porch. My neighbors are never there, so I shit in their outhouse, leave the door open, and stare at their orchard. All the leaves are yellow. All the leaves are orange. All the leaves are fallen brown and damp with almost rain. When my shit falls into the hole, it makes a heavy thud like an animal approaching 1 footfall at a time. The animal tense of shit is shat. I close the door, walk down into the orchard, steal an apple. The apple is red, snow white, shiny, but the flesh inside is stippled worm. I eat the worm. I eat the blight. Rain begins to fall on my keyboard. Mornings like this, words juice out my mouth. It has been a long summer of not enough rain. Salt is a fall in a river. It has been a long fall of not enough rain. The river is now a ravel of bones, all her drops exposed and gaping. There is no ecologically safe way to mourn, writes Diana Coy Nguyen. Salt, pronounced so. A deep sigh. Deer ticks collect in my hair, then travel surreptitiously toward the heat. Each day I walk these old skidder roads until they rut me up, pronate or supinate my steps. The chiropractor says I'm beginning to twist to the right. Yesterday I read that melancholy is a mourning for the self. Am I mourning for myself or for all of us? The parameters are too hard to find when it's dry like this, dry this long. We're so low on water, I have to remember not to wash my hands. The river is all edges these days. If I slip on the rocks, I fall into the river. If I fall with the river, I fall as the river. If I fall as the river, I become an assault. If the drop is in my heart, then the assault is upon myself. When I turn the tap, the water pours silt, hisses and sputters with pocketed air. Fill a bucket and let the silt drift down. The Al-Anon handbook praises detachment, which it says is not the same as bottling one's rage. To remedy rage, it says go to the garden, pull weeds, and imagine you are ripping out the alcoholic's hair. Dig and imagine you are digging his grave. Some of the things I have dug holes for include dead dogs, fruit trees, outhouses, flowers that wilted for lack of watering. Things my ancestors have dug holes for may or may not have included themselves. Once I pierced a toad with my pitchfork while digging potatoes. I didn't know what to do with the toad or my shame, so I simply mounded the dirt back up and left it. The last time the well ran dry, I watched my husband dig but did not step down into the hole to help. Usually digging is a solitary act. There's no room for someone else inside a hole. When I take a bite of apple and see half a worm, I think, what if all my holes were made of flesh? A poem could rightly be called a hole. I write until I cannot feel my fingertips. Rain stipples the keyboard. Inside me is a dark well waiting for rain. Inside me is all of us waiting darkly for rain. The waterline hovers just above the foot valve. So I had one more, but I've taken too long, so I'm going to forgo that. But thank you so much.
Wow, Julia, that was great. You have totally convinced me about orchards and outhouses being libraries. And the name of that mouse keeps rattling in my head. Piebald
megacolon.
Oh my God, can't make that stuff up. Great, yeah, thank you so much. So thank you all readers. I'm going to turn this back over to Beth, who's going to moderate our Q&A portion.
So people should feel free to post a question in chat, or I can actually see everyone on my screen. So if you want to just raise your hand, that would be fine. Either your actual hand or a virtual hand. And yeah, let's start some discussion. Would anyone like to jump in? Well, I have a thought. So I'm really intrigued by the connection of being creative writers and working in a library. So I'm wondering how your work in a library impacts your poetry. Jefferson, why don't we start with you?
Hey, yeah.
Because you have a library right behind you.
I'm the plant of the library. I mean, I think that I've since I've been working at the Maine Women Writers Collection for the past 5 years or so, every once in a while I find myself writing poems about archives and the stories that I read in archives. It's not, I mean, it's a pretty small percentage, but I find the work very inspiring, and there's just something. Maybe the only word I can come up with is magical, for the sense of like holding poets' papers and just like reading through the correspondence and feeling like this is someone's life here in front of me. And I feel so honored to do that. And that often, even if it doesn't end up as a poem, can just be generally inspiring.
I know that sensation as a historian working in archives and holding private papers or letters that haven't been out of an envelope in 150 years, that were perhaps intended as private, but now I'm viewing what was once secret. And it's both an honor, and it's just, to me, it drives me to find more stories, just to keep telling these stories. Peggy or Emma, would you like to jump in here?
Sure. It's so interesting that all of us have read poems and we're also speaking story. For a folklorist, there's so much closeness between oral stories and poetry. And in putting an archive together, folklore and traditions collected by my students, I see that over and over again. You know, they would say, oh, you're putting this in an archive? These stories of mine are important enough? And so as librarians, archivists, storytellers, and poets, we say yes, important enough, absolutely.
I think as far as my work goes, as a public librarian, and I maintain the adult collection here at the library, there's always like a huge a churn of like works coming in and out all the time. So we've got new works coming in, new stories, new poetry, and then we've got interlibrary loan, where you see what other people have ordered from different places, and so it's all this this churn of other works all the time. So you really do get a sense of yourself in the midst of that. You know, it's like you're living in the kind of wash of all that work. So it must be it. I know it must influence me, even if it's not overt. I know for a fact that I'm like in there all the time, and it's part of my life. So it's part of this whole being in it, that I think is where I find the most inspiration, and feel like I'm part of it, part of a community through other people's words.
I see a question from Carl, and asking, do any of you have library dreams?
I can go if no one else is. I dream that it's Friday and it's near closing time, but someone's forgotten to close the door and lock it, and everyone is still streaming in. And I'm trying to tell them that it's closed, but I don't really want to tell them to leave, but I kind of have to. So that's the recurring library dream, where, you want people to come in, but you should have closed the door, and people are still, I guess it's a bit of a nightmare, really. But yeah.
I have accidentally dreamed that I live at the library. Like I just, like the library is there, but it's just my house, and it's just in the dream, and it's just sort of a given that I live there. But I'm a peculiar and avid dreamer, and my dreams do find their way into my poems often.
This reminds me of the Twilight. I think it was a Twilight Zone episode where a man stalks a bomb shelter with all of the books he ever wants to read, and he fights the crowd and makes it into the shelter, only to break his glasses as he closes the door. That would be my nightmare. Matthew.
So first of all, thank you to all of you for sharing your work with us tonight. It's just wonderful. And of course, I have a whole cluster of questions, but I'm going to kind of try and get it to one, which is sort of twofold. You I'm going to assume value. Being in a library is really important to you. It's a deeply meaningful space. And it is for me too, as a literary scholar. So, but that's an assumption I'm making. And one of the wonderful things about libraries for me, and also of independent bookstores, was always the possibility of a chance encounter. That I might stumble upon a book that would prove to be really important to me. And independent bookstore, that can be a little bit more selective because it's kind of been edited. But anyhow, that's been one of my great pleasures. Has been that. But and so where I'm going for this is sort of twofold. A friend of mine who's a poet once said, we don't know who people are going to be reading 100 years from now. And I wanted to say, no, but we do. But when I think about it, I'm like 100 years ago in Portland, everybody was reading Longfellow. And if you'd sort of projected who was going to be the global poet of note, it would have been Longfellow. And speaking for myself, Longfellow is basically unreadable today. And if you'd said Emily Dickinson, everybody said, who are you talking about? So we don't know who we're going to be reading 100 years from now. But I'm interested in what poetry has meant and means to you and your poetry. But sort of looking ahead, a way to ask the question would be, if we still have physical library spaces 100 years from now, which I hope that we will, but there was a time when libraries were the internet, and now we have the internet. What would you? So if I can imagine a chance encounter, and somebody would, come upon your book, it would find its way into their hands. What would you hope, that they might experience or feel? And there might be a range of. What would you hope for there, or be happy about, or
That's a very good question and a hard one.
I know it's a lot to drop on you all at once, but
Good.
I mean, if you're having, look, if you can't, this is another way of getting at it, which is to say, what has poetry meant to you, specifically poetry, and does it mean to you today? And both your, reading experiences, what books or poets have been important to you, and or what does your practice, why do you write? And why do you write poetry? And so I think those two might give some sense, maybe kind of triangulate from there to what you might hope or wonder about what somebody might experience. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'd like to take a stab at sort of the original question, as complicated as it is, in two ways. And so one is that when I write a book, I think I'm writing about something. And then when it's published and I'm reading from it, I realized that I was writing about something other than what I was writing about, or at least something additional. And when I wrote Midden, I thought that I was writing about something that had happened 100 years ago. And I was also writing about the present moment. And I didn't know that until I was reading the poems and the horrible things that happened as part of the story of the Malika eviction were happening in versions in the moment when I was reading them in new versions. So when one writes about history, you are writing about the present moment. So with that book, I guess I hope that I don't know. I mean, I hope that it doesn't still feel like that for whoever reads it in 100 years. But I suspect, we keep repeating history. So I would suspect that probably it would still resonate in that way. And then the other piece of this is to say that I had the peculiar honor recently of writing a poem for a time capsule that was buried for the Maine bicentennial. So I wrote a poem that was addressed to the Mainer that would be reading it in 100 years, which was a very bizarre experience. And I still don't really know how I did, but but it was exciting too and fascinating. And to think it collapsed the sort of idea of history, the present and the past all together for me in really interesting ways.
As Julia's speaking there, makes me think about when I've read quite a few times over this past fall from the book that I read from tonight, and there's a feeling like I know what I'm going to read, and I practice reading it, and I feel like this is kind of set thing. But pretty much every time I've read from it, I kind of notice these new things in it. I'm often a little surprised by like, oh yeah, I forgot about that little line in this piece. And sometimes like just the focus of having a reading in front of people and like this consciousness of people looking at you just makes the book feel different. And it's a little bit exciting to me actually. And was just definitely a reason to hope to share books with people. But I guess if there's one feeling that someone picks up a book many years in the future, like some kind of feeling of surprise, like, oh, look at what this thing was, and maybe a little bit of wonder and maybe hopefully a little bit of fun.
For me, if someone picks up my book 100 years from now, I'm hoping that they'll see how they too can connect with writers and poets who went before. Might I go out on a limb and say that I hope that Grimm's folk tales will be alive in 100 years, and I think they will, and folk tales from all over the world, and that people will be remaking them to suit their lives, as Julia was talking about the poems in her first book, stories that mean so much to us often because we see parts of ourselves in them, but we also need to get inside those stories and shift them somehow. And I hope that connection and those shifts are what someone might see in my book.
Marilyn.
Hi, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to see Peggy. So two things, Beth, that episode of The Twilight Zone was called, I think, Time Enough at Last with Burgess Meredith, and he was actually outside of a library and thought he had access. But Julia, you were saying about being able to see, for example, an outhouse and thinking about it as an archive. And I was reminded of being at my grandparents' farm when I was a kid, and I preferred to use a chamber pot because I hated the outhouse because of all the bugs. But I've actually, I've been in one, and so I've got an experience. But I'm wondering if somebody who doesn't know about an outhouse goes to one, how they might, quote, read it. In many respects, it's different in regard to an archive, because here are, for example, all of these books, and I might look at the books differently from somebody who somebody else who comes in and looks at them, but they're there for all of us. But the reading of, for example, an outhouse of an orchard is really different depending on people's experience. I in a way, I totally agree with you, but in a way, I'm having trouble kind of putting it together. So I mean, totally off the wall, but I love the analogy.
No, I mean, it's fair enough. It is a little bit off the wall, and I acknowledge that. So the library that I'm library director of is a very small, I am the sole paid staff and I'm part-time. So it's a very small, tiny library in a small town in Maine. And when I became the library director there, I started to realize that librarians are the most innovative people in the world, and that they're constantly thinking of new ways to consider what makes a library. So I started learning about seed libraries, and I started learning about bicycle libraries and tool libraries, and how many different ways there are of creating a library. So I think there's a part of me that wants to think that any collection of individual deposits is a library, and in that sense, an outhouse would go in with it. But I also think that libraries, as a public librarian, I love the idea of public library, but I don't know that all libraries are public. We have private libraries. And so an outhouse is perhaps a private library. And I don't know that there are types of, just as we enter books sometimes and we don't know how to read them, and we have to learn by sometimes, by failing or getting what we can out of it or just falling through it. I think that there are lots of kinds of archive in life that we have to learn and texts that we learn and encounter the same way. So I agree that it's off the wall, and I'm still kind of really into thinking about it that way.
Well, thank you. I see that we are over time. So I think to be considerate of everyone's time in this busy season, I want to thank our behind the scenes crew, Lee and David and Sarah, who have all been working behind the scenes tonight. And I very much want to thank our guests tonight, Julia and Emma and Peggy, and of course, Jefferson, for both reading and hosting tonight. So thank you, everyone, for joining us here at the Maine Women Writers Collection. And be well, and I hope we'll see you at a future event. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.